2 of our series called Refocus, a study through the book of 1 Corinthians. What does it look like to follow Jesus in a jacked up church? That's what we've been journeying through. The book of 1 Corinthians, written to the church in Corinth, which was planted by Paul in Acts chapter 18, about 3 to 5 years before this letter was written, as we kind of talked about last week. Today we're going to continue through chapter 1. Now, honestly, as I was looking at how we wanted to journey through this book, I was hoping we would cover all of chapter 1 last week, but there's just too much meat in chapter 1. So we're taking the second half of chapter 2 today. So open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. You can either pull out your app on your phone or go ahead and open up the Bibles on your tables there. By the way, if you don't have a Bible at home or you have a friend who doesn't have a Bible and you want to give them this gift, please feel free, take a Bible home with you today and join us as we read through Scripture together, which, by the way, if you saw the announcements on the screens before and after worship, you'll see that we're reading through the entire New Testament and the book of Psalms right now during this year. We just finished up the book of Romans, and we're going to continue on. If you want to be a part of that and get a daily text message, you can text in RCC READ to 88202, I believe is the number. It's up on the screen. Crochet is on top of it. So take a look here at 1 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to begin in verse 18. Now, if you remember, just to set the context, we had to go to Acts chapter 18 in order to really understand the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Here, let's just kind of quickly glance back at last week. The main thing needs to stay the main thing. That's what Paul's getting at here. In fact, if you were to quickly read through the first half of the first chapter here, you would see that Paul is writing this letter to the people in Corinth because there's been some things going on that are distracting them from the main thing. He's calling them to refocus on Jesus. Why? Because there's divisions in the church now. The church is jacked up. And to be honest with you, there is no perfect church. This isn't a perfect church. We're far from that. But as we journey through life together, how can God call us back to refocus on Him? That's what Paul gets at. They've been fighting amongst each other, and a lot of it is over some power struggle, which we'll get to in just a minute. I want to quickly read verse 18 through the end of chapter 1, just so you can start to catch a glimpse of what Paul is now shifting his focus to, so that we can be encouraged to shift our focus this morning. Follow along here in verse 18. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, or in the translation can also be for those who are on the road to ruin. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The cross is the power of God. We'll come back and flesh this out in just a moment. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know Him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand miraculous signs. Greeks look for wisdom. But we, Paul says, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God. I would underline that if I were you. And the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. Are you starting to hear the language that Paul's using for us to be comparing and contrasting our wisdom, our power, our foolishness to His power, His wisdom, His foolishness? Do you hear how Paul's setting that up? Let's keep going here. Brothers, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. In other words, not many of you were in powerful positions. Verse 27, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God, that is, our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let him who boasts boast in the Lord. Now, there's a lot to unpack in here, and we're not going to be able to get to every little bit of it, but I want to make sure that we do unpack some of it. What Paul is doing here for us is putting in perspective the idea of what it means to focus on Jesus. I don't know if you've been on any road trips when it's snowing outside, but there's probably two really important things when you're going on a road trip and it's when it's snowing outside. The first thing that's really important when you go on a road trip is you make sure you're on the right road going in the wrong direction. Anybody ever messed that up before? Ever go the wrong way? You're going north when you're supposed to be heading south. You're going on the wrong road. You accidentally got on Highway 65 and you should have been on Highway 66. Ever do anything like that? When you're going on a road trip, especially a long road trip where you got like a solid 10, 12, 14, 16-hour car ride ahead of you, the last thing you want to do is get on the road, head the wrong direction for an hour before you discover it. That is a bad start to a road trip, isn't it? The second thing that's most important, especially when it starts to snow outside, and thankfully we can talk about snowing now. I mean, I think some of us are a little wounded from how hard this winter was and all the snow and ice that we had, and you're still healing, so it's okay for us to like bring up the topic of snow and ice again. But in case you haven't healed, you might just want to do earmuffs for a few minutes. I mean, when you go on a road trip and it's snowing outside, it's important for you, one, to make sure that you're going on the right road in the right direction, but two, for you to keep your eyes on the road, right? You got to be focused, especially when it's snowing. And really, inside of that, even if you look a little more deeply at that, you can't just keep your eyes on the road. I mean, we know that texting and driving isn't good. Some of you need to hear that this morning, right? Texting and driving, not a good idea, especially when it's snowing. But when it's been snowing for a little while and the roads are getting a little slick, you can't just keep your eyes on the road. And you know this because when you've been driving through this for a long time, you get really tired, don't you? Because not only do you have your eyes focused on the road, but you have your eyes focused on those two tracks that you got to keep your tires in these treads of the vehicles that have gone before you so that you can avoid driving on the snow and the ice, right? You can't just focus on the road. You've got to focus on those two treads. Paul, this morning, is taking us on a journey and calling us to, one, identify the road or the path that we're on, and two, when you're on that path, what is it you need to be honed in on? What is it you need to pay very close attention to? What is it that we need to focus on? This is what he does. Those first few verses there that we read, verse 18, Paul says this, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing," or again, different translation, "who are on the road to ruin. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." Now, here's what's interesting about this, and we wouldn't necessarily clue in on this unless we took some time to digest it. Usually when you compare foolishness to something, it's not power, but foolishness is the antonym of, what would you say? Wisdom, right? Intelligence. I would say wisdom is spot on. Foolishness versus wisdom. But what Paul compares foolishness to is power. Usually when you compare and contrast power or strength, it's contrasted to what? Weakness, right? But here, Paul is comparing foolishness to power. Now, if you were getting this letter from Paul, you're in the church in Corinth, and he says the word power, I guarantee you there's one idea that comes to mind, and it really predominates over all ideas of power, and that is military power. You're thinking more of a forceful kind of power, a strength. How your army compares itself to the next army, how many areas and regions and countries you're able to overcome and take over. Your power is on display in that moment. Yet Paul sets us up with comparing that not to weakness, but to folly or foolishness. He says, to everybody who's on the road to ruin, the idea of Jesus being on the cross and that being power for us is foolish to them. Anybody else notice that it's prom season right now? There may not be a better season of the year than prom season for us to talk about where power is truly demonstrated. Any dads in the room? Any dads? Come on, just raise your hands up. Dads, come on, raise your hands. Awesome. And some of you might even be dads of little girls, or maybe not so little girls now, right? And prom season has come up. Now, I've already had this conversation with Mia, but I said, if someday we ever have a daughter, I'm going to make some very wise investments. Things that would hurt a young man if he takes her out on a date someday, right? You've all had this talk. You've all had this idea before, and you get to see this on display in prom season. No joke. I was on Facebook recently, and I saw a picture of a dad who was sending his daughter off for prom night. Her date had come to pick her up. They took pictures, all that stuff, and there's a picture of him off by himself with his arms like this, looking so ticked off, like, you better bring her back the same way she's leaving, or else. And, it's almost like you could see it in his eyes. It's like he wanted to answer the door with like a baseball bat in his hands, right? Or invest in a shotgun and be cleaning the shotgun, which I don't have a gun or anything, but I'm probably going to invest in one and be cleaning it every time my daughter's date comes over to pick her up. I'm going to definitely put the power on display. You know what I mean? I want that guy to know that I'm in charge here. When the Corinthians are looking at and trying to understand power, they expect that the one who's going to save them, Jesus, would show up with that same kind of power on display, so that everyone would know our King has power over all things. But the kind of power that Jesus came to bring was not a power over people, but a power for people. This week I've been doing a little studying here on 1 Corinthians, and I'm reading this book. It's just an exegetical study on the book of 1 Corinthians written by a theologian named Anthony Thistleton. If you wanted to pick it up, it's a great read as we kind of journey through the book of 1 Corinthians. But in here, he talks about how Paul refers to the idea of power as it's contrasted to folly or foolishness instead of power contrasted with weakness. He says this: the power of the cross is not that of sheer force or of the big battalions, if you will. Jesus rejected such notions of power in his resistance to the messianic temptations, each of which enticed him to adopt a crude shortcut to raw power. You can imagine if a king is going to put on display his power, he's going to do things like, especially through the use of the spectacular, to manipulate belief by quasi-mechanical or rhetorical persuasion. If Jesus wants to convince you that he has power over all things, then clearly the way he would show up would be in a way to demonstrate that power. Miracles, the spectacular, the awe-inspiring things to show you he's in charge. Now, he did all those things. He healed. He brought people back to life. He gave sight to the blind. But in that, Jesus still was journeying to the cross. Paul, in his writings, when he uses the word power, is most characteristically denoting that which is effective. So when we read the word power here in verse 18, Paul's not just talking about a power over things that Christ would put on display, but he's saying Christ is the only one who it works. It just works with Jesus. Jesus' power on the cross is what answers the bell every single time. Now, that doesn't really matter. It's almost like Paul is begging us to ask the question, whenever we put our trust in something, it's like he's subversively asking this question. So you've been putting your trust in powerful things, status, money, position, authority, whatever it may be. He's asking the question here, how's that working out for you? When he talks about power, he's begging us to ask the question, can it work for your life like what Jesus did on the cross? I mean, what Jesus did, taking our spot, our punishment on the cross in our place so that we would have the same victory that is his, that the death we deserve to die would be his death for us, and that we could live life that is in the resurrection of Jesus on our behalf, that it would be ours just as much as it is his. That Jesus who works on our behalf. Is anything that you put your trust in that effective? Do you know power like that? I have a lot of friends that would say, well, actually, things are working out pretty well for me. Just got a promotion, making a higher salary grade now. I was watching something on TV, and this person that was being presented to everybody was everyone was saying some kind of accolade about this person. You're so rich, you're so famous, you're so popular, you've got everything. We're often taught that when you can have it all, that it must be working out well for you. That could be the case. Things could be working out really well for you. And that's awesome. I'm glad for you. I want that for you. But that's when we lose sight of what road we are on, right? It's not just important for us to keep our eyes on the road, to keep our eyes focused on Jesus. But we got to make sure we're on the right journey. We got to make sure we're heading in the right direction, which is why Paul calls us back to remember that very thing. Paul says here in verse 18, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are on the road to ruin, but to us who are on the road to salvation, eternal life, it is the power of God." See, the cross of Jesus and its power, its strength, its effectiveness in our lives does not matter unless we recognize what kind of road we're on. If you're on a road to wealth and climbing the ladder, being popular, having lots of friends, having the most like buttons clicked on all of your pictures, if that's the road you're on, then hey, you're doing great. But if we lose sight of the road and the direction that every single one of us is going in, a road that leads to the end of our lives here on earth, a reality that we often ignore, if we're not aware that we're on that road, then the cross means nothing for us. That's why Paul says it's foolishness. It's foolishness for those who don't believe in God. It's foolishness to those who are on the road to ruin. Because it doesn't matter if what happens after this life doesn't matter to you. I remember when I was taking a road trip with some friends, it was really easy for us to veer off and stop at different places and to be distracted by all the signs and all the things around us. And sometimes, I don't know if you're like this or not, but text messages or emails as they pop up as you're driving in the car, they can become a distraction along the way, can't they? And for each and every one of us as we're on this journey of following Jesus in an imperfect church, there can be so many things vying for our attention. When in the middle of that, in the middle of all that clutter and all the noise and everything around us, vying for our attention, Paul is asking us not just to keep the main thing, but keep your eyes focused on the cross, because that's where power resides. If you were to turn down just a little bit farther here into verse 21, Paul continues to share with us how this wisdom of God, this strength of God, this power of God is effective in our lives. He says this, "For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand miraculous signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified." The power of God working in our lives. You know what's interesting about God's work on our behalf, the power of Christ, if you will, versus the folly of self-independence and trusting and relying in ourselves and not being aware of how God's at work in our lives, is that relying on the strength of the cross is transformative of who we are and claims us as his children. Whereas folly actually leads us to try harder, to strain ourselves, to invest more, to do everything that we possibly can. But that's what we want to buy into so often, isn't it? And when we lose sight of the cross, when we lose sight of Jesus, when we lose sight of the path that we're on, knowing that someday, seeing Jesus on his throne for all of eternity in heaven, or the truth of hell itself, ruin, and knowing that that is coming, do we want to rest on our own abilities, the foolishness that Paul is talking about here, or do we want to rest on the strength and the power of Jesus? Because in his death on the cross, everything that you need for this journey on this road has been done for you in Jesus. Now, as we go through this book of 1 Corinthians, there's going to be plenty of time for us to look at how this applies tangibly in our marriages, in our relationships, in our workplaces, in sexuality, in situations where we feel like we're really at the end of our rope. We're going to touch on all those things over the next couple of weeks because that's what 1 Corinthians does. But for today, what Paul is calling us to consider is this. When we have in sight the road that we're on, that there is eternity at the end of that road, and he's calling us to keep in focus the cross of Jesus, will we be tempted to sacrifice the most important things of our lives, the faith that we hold on to in Jesus? Will we sacrifice that most important thing on the altar of the urgent? Each and every one of us has so many temptations every single day to be torn in one direction or another, to have something distract us. I mean, how easy is it for us just during the workday to get caught up in scrolling through Facebook on our phones or on going through Twitter just to see what's going on? I mean, I find myself doing that just because it's so urgent. It's so right now, it's so immediate that I can be in the know on something right now that it distracts me from what could be more important. I mean, when the email dings on your computer, how easy is it to be completely distracted and pulled off course of whatever it is you were focused on working on, that it pulls you away from that, and now your focus is on something that's more urgent than it is important, perhaps. In this text here, it's about something so much more than text messages or emails or the dings that you get on your computer or whatever it may be. On this road, though, with everything vying for our attention, saying, this is urgent, this is pressing, take care of this now, will we sacrifice the importance of the cross being central in our lives on this road that we're on for the sake of the urgent things around us. Paul is calling each and every one of us. God's word today is calling each and every single one of us to stay focused on the important, Jesus, his sacrifice for us. To take care of the urgent things, to be mindful of those things, to not ignore those things, but to always make sure we keep our eyes on the road as we are on the right road with him. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to continue to hear this theme coming up as we journey through the book of 1 Corinthians. But right now is a time for you to just reflect and respond to what it is that God's calling you to. If you're anything like me, there's times along the way where it's easy to get distracted. And maybe over the last couple of weeks or months or whatever it may be, there's been distractions pulling you away from seeing Jesus as the focus. Maybe this morning God's just calling you back to refocus on him. Maybe there's something in your marriage that it hasn't been focused so much on Jesus. Maybe there's something in your job. Maybe, and I don't know what it is. Maybe there's an addiction that has been tearing you away from the focus on the cross. This morning, I just simply want to invite you to consider refocusing on the road that Jesus has us on. His cross, central in our sights.